Please join me in welcoming Scott to the Strand.
What I'd like to do tonight is a few more introductions, but then really share with you several things about the book. First of all, I'll try to share a little bit about the kind of origins of the book, why it was written and how we got here today. And secondly, I'll try to share kind of the book format, because it has a unique format of the childhood story and global connection essays around the global development goals. And then I'm going to tell you my story and share with you what that meant to me and to my present day work. And finally, last but not least, is I'm going to share with you a call to action that I think is important to all of us in this sense of uncommon times. But let me start with a few more introductions. Again, it's just a privilege to be here with all of you. Some of you are patrons of Strand who I haven't gotten to meet before. Some of you are family. Some of you are international nonprofits that we get to work with, including the International Rescue Committee, ECPAT, which is against anti-trafficking of children. UNICEF will be here tonight. Fantastic. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Janet Bencroft, who is one of the worldwide advocates for women around the world, particularly women who are victims of war crimes and of rape. And she has really championed the rule of law so that women can be protected. So it is terrific to have you all here. And my two daughters out of my three daughters are here tonight with me. So Haley and Lindsay. So it's fantastic to have them and their friends. And my editor, without whom I would have never made it to a publisher, Laura Asher, is here tonight. So really appreciate you being here, Laura. And last but not least is our publisher, Select Books, so Kenzie and Nancy Sugihara. And truly without them, the book would not have been published. So thank you, everyone, Strand, family, and friends, for being here. I also want to kind of recognize that this is the second anniversary of the Global Development Goals for Sustainability. And so while those goals are recognized, in theory, they're not here tonight with us. They are so important because without such a framework, 192 countries came together to agree on those goals 2 years ago, with 169 targets that by 2030 we would have done some things very specific that hopefully will have helped all of us in three major ways. One of those being to eradicate extreme poverty, people still living on $2 or less a day. Secondly is to make tremendous progress in very specific ways around the gender gap and around equity, including economic equity. And thirdly is to make some progress on climate change. So those 17 goals are really encompassed in those three major areas. And we're here tonight to celebrate that second anniversary and the tremendous work, which I'll share a little bit about with some of the nonprofits that are here, that's going on around the goals. So let me tell you just a few things about the origins of the book. Whenever I would share my personal story, particularly early on in my professional career, people would always say, you should write a book. And we've all heard that before, right? And so I began to think seriously about that, mainly because my story began to be what would drive me and compel me to have the passion around my work for children around the world and for international development. I realized that children like me, who had had good and bad things happen to them, had these choices they had to make. They had to decide whether they were a victim or a survivor, as I heard from awardees of the Gender Rights Awards earlier this week. They had to choose the charity within, which I define as the positive, the will to continue to make things better regardless of the circumstances that you're given. And too often, I think, children choose the negative, the anger. And certainly for me, there has been that choice that you have to daily, deal with. But I think what I learned was that it was really the impact of all of us, the others around those children, that helped them choose the positive, to choose the charity within. And so that made me really feel like it was important to share the story, and that I was one of many children, but that it was all about what all of you do every day that helps each and every one of those children choose the positive and not the negative. So in that context, I went about, really trying to find an agent, and my hope was to have a publisher, a real publisher that could help me, and that actually would make the book better. And little did I know that an unknown author who wanted to do good things in the world was just really not somebody anybody was thinking would sell books. And so a memoir is probably the hardest thing in the world to sell from an unknown person. And but that journey led me to an amazing agent, and Carol Mann, and to Laura, and ultimately to Select Books. In fact, I was actually speaking to a group of executives from the corporate sector 2 years ago, and my staff at Global Impact didn't have time to really work on the speech. So I said, no worries, I'll take it from here. So I gave my personal story, which I'm going to share in a minute, and really talked about the importance of that story of making a personal connection to these goals, and why all of us in that room had to make it personal. It couldn't just be what their companies wanted to do. It couldn't just be the right thing. It had to be because they could personally connect with how they could make a difference in the world, and these goals could be a part of that. And you could hear a pin drop. I thought, uh-oh, this is a problem. UNICEF's not going to be happy. But it turned out that people really appreciated that, and that they all felt like they could, if they could connect their own personal story to their work, that it could have much greater meaning. And I think that's important for all of us. So I sat down, I thought, if only, the agent could have heard this, she'd know we could have sold some books. And about an hour later, completely unrelated, I got an email from the agent saying, we have this wonderful publisher, Select Books, and they're interested in your story, but only if you connect it to your present day work and to sustainability and the global development goals. And that was Kinsey and Nancy. And so it really has been a journey to kind of connect the book to present day work. So let me share a little bit about the book format. So the book format is this childhood story, and then after each chapter of the story, there is an essay, essentially a global connection essay, which talks a little bit about the issue and the impact that that issue had on my own childhood, but also then how it relates to these global development goals, these 17 goals that really cover, again, eradicating poverty, gender equity, health equity, and then also climate change. And then there's a little bit about the nonprofits are doing amazing work, and that's really powerful. And so, in fact, even this week, if you go to the charity.org or Global Impact, you'll see a whole social media campaign promoting the work of the amazing charities that are here today: the Global Justice Center, UNICEF, IRC, ECPAT. And so it's a very interesting kind of combination, but it was intended to make this personal connection between any of our journeys and the global development goals. So just to share a little bit about why these goals are so important, one of the goals that UNICEF and SAVE and many others are involved with is about really reducing and eliminating the children that die every year from preventable diseases and preventable causes. And we've made great progress. I mean, I think it was as high as about 12 million a year in probably the early 2000s, Baron, don't you think? And today it's more like 5 to 6 million a year. That's still a lot of children, right, that are dying unnecessarily. And one of the things that we don't realize is that well over 1 million of them die from pneumonia in the first month of their life. And we know how to solve pneumonia, right? We know how to, I mean, it's not even diarrhea. It's not even other things that require, more medicine. I mean, we know how to solve this. And yet, we haven't. And so these goals really help 192 countries, whether they're donor countries or whether they're developing countries, to say, these are problems we can solve. And so that's why this framework is so important. And whether the United States is a signer of the climate change or not, these goals still cover, climate change and the other areas. So they're important. So let me share with you a little bit about the book itself and take me with you and read just a few excerpts. I won't take a lot of time. We'll have some time for questions and more wine and cheese, hopefully. Take Me With You, the title of the book, comes from the context of the following. My mother was an abused spouse or wife, and when she would try to escape, sometimes on a daily basis, I would say, "Take me with you." And she did eventually, but it was a difficult childhood, and because the normalcy was about violence and about escaping the violence, whether it was escaping it to the neighbor or escaping it for a movie, but it was still, for us, it was kind of the norm. And I'll read for you kind of just an excerpt or two of some of the early chapters. This is kind of one of the kind of moments in time in which I realized this was not normal. So I was probably at the age of about 4 or 5. So I remember another day around this time when Mom and I spent hours preparing a roast for dinner. I remember feeling excited about Dad coming home, the smell of meat, vegetables, potatoes filling the parsonage. And shortly after Dad arrived, he began yelling when he noticed the cans of food in the kitchen cabinet were out of order. "You can't even keep the cabinets neat." "Well, I've made you dinner," Mom replied. "Yeah, well, you can't even keep this kitchen clean. We need to clean up this mess." "You can clean it up, but we're going to eat." Dad threw one of the cans down and screamed, "I'm not going to eat until this is cleaned up." Mom proceeded to empty the entire cabinet onto the floor. "Go to hell," she said. She threw the silverware drawer at him and tried to run past. He pushed Mom across the room, began to shake her. She fought back. Screams filled the house. I began to cry. Dad's strength and weight overpowered Mom easily. Chaos filled the house. I had been setting our tiny card table with silverware. I remember saying, "Stop it," covering my ears with my hands to try to drown out the noise. I still had a fork in my left hand. The next thing I knew, I was banging the large carving fork against an upright piano in the living room. Ivory shards flew from the piano keys with each clang of the fork. Suddenly, Mom ran through the living room. Dad chased her. His rage bulged from his neck and temples thick veins of hate. Mom slammed the bathroom door. Dad pounded on it with his fists. We never did eat the dinner. For the rest of our lives together, the broken piano keys reminded me of that night and when the facade of our happy home life abruptly ended. So it was a difficult time. But ultimately, we did escape. And my mom did hear my call, and she took me with her. And what was interesting was what happened next. So she had been encouraged to go to counseling to a Reverend Jefferson Jackson that we had met because my biological father was also a pastor. And he and the Reverend Jefferson Jackson were the first co-chairs of the Ministerial Black and White Alliance of Kansas City in 1968. And for millennials in the room, that was the year that Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, and was really an apex of civil rights issues. It was also the same year that ultimately Kansas changed their laws and allowed interracial marriages. So many states, even 1968, 1969, you may have seen the Loving movie, were still changing their laws to allow for interracial marriages. Hard for us to imagine today. And yet maybe it's not so hard for us to imagine. Well, so Sydney, my mother, fell in love with the Reverend Jefferson Jackson, and all heck broke loose. So he lost his church. The black community was also not happy. And my mother, who had been the first teacher of Bonner Springs High School for integrated students, and in those days when they began to integrate the schools in the Midwest and the South, but particularly in Kansas, they started by integrating the African American kids with the special education kids. So all of them were put in a special education class in high school. So they actually didn't have to be integrated, but they were still in the same high school. And so my mother taught special ed and all the African American students, and she was nominated as Teacher of the Year of the state of Kansas, but she also lost her job. And we had, a cross burned. By then we lived in a trailer in Edwardsville, Kansas, on a piece of property that my mom still had from her family. And there was a small fire from a cross one evening. So it was really quite interesting, but probably, most significant for me was that there was also a custody battle because there was such embarrassment, not only by my biological father, but kind of community around him, that I would be living with Jefferson. And we were losing that custody battle, and the final court hearing was the next day, and we knew that we were going to lose. And so we shut the door on the trailer, the mobile home, and we got on an airplane, and we went to Vancouver, British Columbia, because we felt like if we went north instead of south, that was a better way to go for our family. And so we made our way to Vancouver, British Columbia, and I remember the mountains and the ocean and the skylight. And I thought this will be better. But we didn't have work permits, so we couldn't stay very long. And so we began to make our way down, hopefully discreetly, to the state of Washington. So we took the ferry system from, Vancouver, British Columbia, to Vancouver Island, then to a place called Port Angeles, which is on, the very far Olympic Peninsula, for those of you that are familiar with the area. And we were on a ferry. And here we were, Jefferson, Sydney, myself, Trixie, who was a little poodle, who Jefferson had given my mother, poodle in a purse, I used to call him. We had maps then, no GPS. And a gentleman with a felt hat and a feather in his hat, Canadian gentleman, came up to us from nowhere and said, you people really ought to think about this place called Sequim, Washington. So people from all over the world are moving there, retirees, writers, and they would accept you. And it's about 15 miles from where you'll land on the ferry. And then he walked away. So I'm sure he was some form of angel. So we got off the boat and the ferry, and sure enough, we had a hard time getting a taxi, hard time getting a hotel room. Not as bad as Kansas, but, still not that great. And we made our way the next morning to Sequim, Washington, and hit out on a horse ranch. And then finally, I was entered back into the school system. And somewhere along the line, probably gave my real name. And sure enough, one day, the authorities came, the police, and they took me by armed escort to the detention center, held my mother for contempt of court and kidnapping, and there was a quick trial the next morning, and it was determined that I would be taken by escort back to Kansas to live with my father. In that context, my mother and Jefferson were able to see me for just a minute or two at the juvenile center before I was taken back away. And they gave me this green knit hat that they had a woman from the church. Jefferson had started preaching by then, and at the Veterans of Foreign War Center in Sequim. And it had $20 bills sewn inside it, and then a Bible with phone numbers of people across the United States. So off I went back to Kansas, and 6 months later, after not being able to receive any mail, and in the book it's in a chapter called "I Love You," that I realized that something was wrong, because I knew my mother would try to reach me. And so we were at the post office at the beginning of a snowstorm in Kansas. I went back 30 years later and traced all of it and the weather, and it's amazing, but it was essentially a very, very large snowstorm. And it was the beginning of it. We went into this small post office, and I could see my mother's handwriting on this letter that my father was taking. I said, "That's my letter." But I didn't get it. And then we had a tremendous fight over it, both on the way away from the town to the house, and then at the house, and I lost. And then he came back and gave me the letter, and had already been opened, and said, "There's nothing in it, you can have it." And it had 3 words. It said, "I love you." And so I knew my mother also could not communicate, and that I was, whether she meant it or not, I would be fading in her memory, and they were fading in mine. And I knew that they had unconditional love, and I needed to get back there, because that was how I was going to be able to be a positive person. I didn't know all that quite in the same way as today. So I found my Bible, I found my knit hat, and I got a deflated basketball just in case I needed it, and put it all outdoors and said I just wanted to go look at the snow, and started my way, and made my way back ultimately to Washington State.
How old were you?
12, 13. So it all happened, all of the story happens kind of between 10 and 13. And then this time was during that. And the interesting thing was that I wasn't sure if this is what I should do, but once I started going, it was kind of one foot in front of the other. In fact, I'll try to read you a very short excerpt in that. This is, at this point in time, I've escaped, and I've probably gone about 12 miles through the woods, through this large campground, making my way to another town, another small town called DeSoto. And by then I had a thorn in my foot, kind of everything that could happen. I was wearing tennis shoes, carrying a basketball, not really prepared for a Kansas blizzard. And so there was only one way to get to DeSoto, the Wyandotte Street Bridge. At this point in time, I'm underneath a berm. So you know how you have a railroad and you have a rise up that kind of hides the railroad from sometimes the road next to it? Well, that's where I was, because the police car with the chains was coming up and down that road looking for me. And so I had to stay near the railroad tracks and the river, the Kansas River. So I knew that I had to come up from that railroad track and from the river and get into this next town if I was going to make any progress. You know, I couldn't stay where I was forever. So almost instinctively, I reached up, touched my hat, felt the money inside. The snowfall had nearly stopped. A cold wind blew, undiluted, down the tracks. I pulled the hat tight over my ears. My left foot still stung. I didn't know how long it would take. I started jogging east along the edge of the tracks. The snow cover was lighter here than in the field. After a few minutes, the tracks crossed a small stream that ran toward the river. From here, it was about 1.5 miles to Wyandotte. I kept moving along the bottom of the berm, watching for spikes and other debris. The sound of an engine startled me. It came from the road. I stopped. Whoever it was, they were driving slowly. I lowered my body, climbed the rail berm. In the distance, I saw the flashing red and blue police lights. I kept my head to the tracks and watched as the car moved closer. So just to give you kind of a feel of this, time and trying to get back, to the state of Washington and to Jefferson and to Sydney. What was amazing was that when I did get back, and I won't tell you everything about that part of the story, I learned that my mom and Jefferson had taken this to the Supreme Court of the state of Washington, and they had reversed this on the grounds of race, and that it was to be heard by an appeals court. But at this point in time, this was now a civil trial, no longer a criminal trial. And so I had to be in that state for that trial to get scheduled. But sure enough, all of a sudden, I was there. And all of SQUIM turned out for the trial, and this time I got to speak to the judge, which I'd never been allowed before. And I was allowed to stay with my mom and Jefferson. And then for $25, I could change my name so I could have his name. So, that really was kind of the critical story. There's a lot of other pieces to it. But I think it was that story that then, allowed me to be open enough to what would happen next. So it was the others. It was Jefferson. It was my mom. It was the community of SQUIM. It was where I worked in a small kind of department store called Southwoods. It was school. For me, it was education. In fact, in many ways, it's one of the top global development goals is education, especially for girls and especially for children, because it's such a great equalizer. And in this country, it has such important meaning still. But it was the others, right? It was all of you that helped me choose the positive and also helped me choose to be involved with global development, with international issues, and even with domestic charities. So that's, a little bit about the story. I have to tell you, though, that the book and the story really end with more of the present day. Because many years later, after I had my own 3 amazing daughters and had the opportunity to work with amazing organizations, I took a trip with World Vision, who I worked with at the time, to the World Vision Women's Rehabilitation Center in northern Uganda. This is where women whose arms have been cut off, where they've been raped, their breasts have been mutilated, they've been forced to have children, all in what was called the Lord's Liberation Army. And Coney, you may recall, and this was a 20-plus year ongoing, slow onset, essentially civil war, which has now finally ended. But there were well over 1 million people in refugee camps in northern Uganda for those 20 years, if you can imagine. And what would happen would be the Lord's Liberation Army would come and they would steal the boys at night and have them be entered into the army, and they would chop off the arms or legs of girls so that they would be enslaved. And so women who would escape ultimately needed a place to go to try to figure out how to live after all that. So World Vision, UNICEF, others ran centers and ran particularly the children's camps inside the refugee camps. So we were there to see that, but we also were confronted with the night walkers. So in this terrible 20 plus years, which is still the remnants of, but has at least ended the Civil War, is that essentially children, to protect them during the times in which the resistance army was known to be in the area in northern Uganda, is that the children in the villages would finish school, leave their homes still during daylight and dusk, and get to Gulu, the capital, where they could be kept safe in these large encampments that were run by the United Nations and by the international nonprofit organizations. They then would get a little something to eat, and they would do their homework by floodlights in these large kind of stadium-like centers with girl and boy barracks. And then the next morning at maybe 5, 6 a.m., they would all go have breakfast with their families and go to school. And that's how they tried to keep these kids safe. So some weeks and some nights, there could be thousands of children, and then some nights maybe fewer. But in this context, it was kind of a medium to higher level of activity. And so one night after visiting the rehabilitation center and the camps, we then were on the streets of Gulu to show our support for the children of Gulu, or the night walkers that some of you may have seen from other publicity. And all of a sudden the streets started to fill with these thousands and thousands of children. And this was just a medium level of activity. And it was a bit scary, you know. You have all these children around you, and you're not quite sure why. And all of a sudden, I had a kind of a tug on my side, and I looked down, and this little girl who told me her name was Rose said, "Don't be afraid. I'll take you with me." And she grabbed my hand. And so I think for all of us, my call to action is that we don't have to be a rock star like Bono or billionaires like Bill and Melinda Gates, or even famous in any way to make a difference in the world. We just have to be Rose. We have to be willing to take somebody else's hand, to choose the charity, the goodness within versus the negative, and to know that every day, whatever you do, you're going to have an impact on somebody. And so the more you can remember that, the more roses will have a chance in this life. And so I really encourage all of you to think about your time, your talent, your treasure. And during these very uncertain times, it's so easy to think that our own individual actions don't have meaning. But to that one child that we help and encourage so that they don't feel like their only choice is trafficking, to that one child that we help get a good education, you know, we mean something. So I want to encourage all of you, because there's so many heroes in this room, and thank you for what you do. And I hope that Take Me With You is an opportunity for you to encourage all of your peers and all of your friends that this is not a time to give up. This is a time to stand in the gap, and for each of our own journeys to make the decision to choose the charity or the goodness within. So thank you so much. I'm so honored that you came. We can take some questions, but I don't want to keep it from some wine and cheese too. But so feel free.
There you go.
First of all, thank you for taking us on this journey and what Global Impact and you have done for the world's children. Appreciated by all of us. I'm curious to you as a dad, the story you told growing up, how has that modified or changed how you become a better dad?
Yeah, so with two daughters here, I have to be careful, right? Uh, First of all, the way it impacted me was that I didn't want my girls to go through any of this. So in some ways, I didn't share this part of the story. And, a lot of second-generation Americans, you find that as well, who have gone through trauma, that they want their children to have a different life and to not start with those same scars. And so there's a scene in the book in which one of the girls finds a letter from my biological father, who sent one every few years and with $5 for the girls on their birthday. And I just never had the courage to give it to them, right? Because they had lots of love. They had a different family. Jefferson had died by then, but they knew of Jefferson Jackson as their grandfather on my side. They had a wonderful grandfather on the other side. But they said, who is this? What's going on here? And so I think one of the things that changed me was I always wanted them to have a different life. And secondly is I also learned from them that it was so important to share the good and the bad. I'm still learning that. And I think finally what's amazing to me is that little tidbits of just being there for them and many other things that have happened in their life, they've actually chosen their own goodness within, and they're doing amazing things in the world. So, I think we never know, but I think my lessons were, yes, you should try to make sure there's opportunities, and that you come out of this with a different way of being. But you also have to really realize that everybody will be on their same journey, including your kids. Any questions?
Scott,
Yes.
Atul Singh.
Atul, welcome.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm a bit late.
Yeah.
Question, straightforward one. Did the 60s, the fervor and the what the Germans call the Zeitgeist, that change is possible, I can do anything, did that infect you as a child, or was it all internal? My question is, your journey, your odyssey, in fact, took you a remarkable distance at a very tender age, and must have been ups and downs there too.
Yeah.
Was it entirely internal? Was it externally influenced? Was it a bit of both?
Yes. Well, I was very angry as a child. And without Jefferson, how I treat women would be very different. So there were key influences, like my stepfather, that with a lot of hard work, demanded that I respect my mother, demanded that I respect women. I was also angry at the world. And so, it was not easy in the early times. But over time, I think, unconditional love, I think each child has to make their own choices too, so it's both ways, right? So it's not just the work that we do or the influence we have. The person that we're working with has to also choose. So at some point, I felt like that, whether it was because of my faith, my family, those around me, that really it didn't matter what my circumstances were. what mattered is whether I could do something positive in the world. And so it really switched for me, in kind of early high school. And, every day you have to choose the positive still, but it became easier after that.
Hi, Scott. My name is Indrani Garadia, and my work is to reduce violence against women in the world. And for those of us in the audience who don't know, it's 1 in 3. And the World Economic Forum just released that we lose almost $8.3 trillion a year due to violence against women and children. You said without Jefferson, you would treat women a lot differently, and I have to assume that would mean a lot of bad behaviors or unhealthy behaviors. Is there a way for you to use your voice, your forum, your stature in the world now to help us to educate young boys and young girls as what to expect, what to accept, and how to set boundaries around violence? Because if we don't do something, we will keep trying to fight the same stuff 50, 60 years from now, and I'll be dead, but I don't want to leave this problem for my children.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm very committed to using my voice as best I can. In many ways, I just try to do that behind the scenes. The book is kind of going beyond being behind the scenes, but I've testified before Congress against women's violence, and I'm a big believer in some of the work of the organizations here in the room, as well as others like International Center for Research for Women. I think that it's going to take several things. One is that women are and will be a majority in the world, and the world's going to change. The world's going to change. Whether it's in the United States or other countries or even in the developing world, women are going to be our leaders. They're going to be in charge. Already in the international nonprofit sector, women, even if they're not paid sufficiently, are in charge. So we're going to see, economics and women are going to help us change this for good forever. Secondly is I think the millennial generation doesn't look at it the same way. I still think, millennial men, probably have lots of norms and traditions, and whether it's racism or gender, issues. But I think we're erasing a lot of those things. I think one of the voices we need is to not fall backwards, And that's, I think we all have to be diligent right now. We cannot take, affronts that are racist, that are against women, against, developing countries. We cannot take these things and assume that they don't mean anything. We need to be mindful, regardless of our politics, mindful and diligent, and be willing to use our voice. But I do think women rule and are gonna rule. So there we go. Exactly.
Hi.
Yes.
Thanks for talking. I kind of teared up a little bit with the rose line at the one. You can't hear?
No, it's on.
Oh. I was saying thank you for talking. I teared up a little bit with the rose line. I had 2 questions. I just one's kind of weird. The first one's not weird. I just joined the nonprofit world, and I was wondering if you had some books you think have influenced you a lot in a positive way. You think I should probably read. And that's the first one. I don't know if you want to go ahead with that one.
Yeah.
I was gonna write it down, kind
of. Well, if you care about some of these issues, Half the Sky is a great book, and will give you even more sense of what some of the international nonprofits are doing around the world. And then I really encourage you to take a look at some of the websites that the international nonprofits have, because they share, this tremendous work they're doing. And, for example, there's this amazing video. You have to ask her about it. Carol from ECPAT, who oversees ECPAT USA, that they put out today that is just extraordinary about what they're doing to teach children about sex trafficking in the schools. It's really, really powerful. So that's kind of an unknown resource, but there's some great, and there's also great recommendations of books on some of those websites as well. Yeah.
Okay. For the weird question.
Oh, no, please go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. No.
Since I just started working in this field, I was curious if you could share any core beliefs you had about the nonprofit world that you feel very few people in the nonprofit world believe in, something you believe in that you feel most people in the nonprofit world don't believe in, but is one of your core beliefs.
I want to hear that one too.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think sometimes people enter the nonprofit sector because they believe that the nonprofit sector versus the for-profit sector is where you can create civil society and change, and that's even a more valuable or critical profession than the public sector, being involved with government. I actually got excited about being a part of the nonprofit sector because I see it as the sector that can bring all three together: the public, private, and civil society, and the role that civil society can play in human rights, the rule of law, in encouraging key programs that are working. Regardless of the mistakes that the nonprofit sector will make, I think that this ability to bring people together and to move issues forward, even if a government falls backward, or even if the private sector isn't there. But I think that increasingly the nonprofit sector's role will be how to bring those sectors together. It won't be about just the work that the nonprofit's doing. And there's some great organizations here tonight that are really reaching out. Probably you wouldn't have 20 years ago. Is that, Baron, is that right? Yeah. And ECPAT works with the private sector. Probably wouldn't have even imagined that 30 years ago. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. First of all, I want to tell you how inspiring you are. And I know that for publishers, book tours are very expensive, but necessary. But I think you're so effective that somebody should give a grant for you to continue you should go on a 2-year book tour. And
My publisher agrees with you.
And that would combine the public sector with the nonprofit sector. And my second comment is in response to the young man who asked about books to read. And I think From Outrage to Courage by
Yes.
Anne Firth Murray is a very inspiring book because she talks about how women around the world outrage has to, the productiveness of it leads to courage. And so I think that's a very inspiring book. Thank you.
That's a great one. Here's one. Oh.
Coming.
Just to piggyback off of the question back here of how to end violence or that treatment of women globally. First, more of a statement. You mentioned World Vision, and I've seen a successful program where they've trained or mentored men in other countries where this is very much a cultural thing where they've seen their fathers, grandfathers treat women in such a way, and they literally read the Bible in such a way, a man or woman should serve a man and whatnot. And so they take that literally. And so what these programs do are helping to mentor these men on how to not take that literally and how you can still be a faithful person, but, adapt to respecting women, if you will. And I see a direct parallel between that and you and Jefferson, and I wonder if that's the influence, or if you could speak more to that, about how if Jefferson wasn't there, he was your mentor and you saw him treating Sydney a specific way, and if that's that program seems to be a best practice, if you will, and
Yeah.
and represents exactly what you experienced as as an individual.
Yes. Well, I think programs like that are very effective, and they've also been effective in reducing child marriage. So countries like Senegal have actually adopted a no child marriage policy because of work like Tostan and others. And men are as involved in that education process with other men as the women are. And one of the big factors is understanding that women are just as valuable, or more so, as an economic provider. And once you realize that, then the whole nature of the village and how you treat women changes. It's one factor. But I do think these training programs are really important. Jefferson had kind of a short version of the training program. So his was, boy, you are not going to treat your mother like that. You are not going to raise your voice to her. If you do, I will throw you across the room. In fact, there's one scene in there where I mouthed off one too many times, and he was a very strong man, had been labor, preached on Sundays, and then kind of classic African American pastor, then worked labor all week. And I don't even think he meant to, but he threw me across the room into my bedroom, this small house that we lived in, and just said, boy, don't you ever talk to your mother. So, I mean, it was a shortened version of that training program. But I think more importantly, it was how he treated her, So that's really the key, is regardless of differences, I think if people treat each other equally, then hopefully those around them can see that. But it was really about how he treated her. And so again, he chose, every day. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering, it sounds like your background involved people in the church community, and I'm wondering if your current work involves church communities?
Yes, so
especially in light of how patriarchal so many religions tend to be.
Yes. So, the faith-based community is a significant responder in the international nonprofit sector, and they come from lots of different perspectives. So, one of my most currently one of the people who I most admire as a leader is head of the American Jewish World Service, Robert Banks, extraordinary person who reaches out, to all the other faiths in the way he uses his faith for the work of American World Jewish Service. So faith can play a role because it's part of how people choose, right, to focus on the vocation of making sure others have potential. But it can also be very, very damaging. We work with a lot of international nonprofits that are faith-based, and then many that are not. And we really look at their work, and also whether they're proselytizing or whether they're actually providing, programs. Their faith, they may want to help people know their faith, but Global Impact, our job as kind of the International United Way, is about supporting their programs, their work. For me personally, it's my faith is still very strong, but what I learned was it wasn't the denomination, it was about people living their faith. And, one of the things I probably haven't done, because I had so many different experiences in my faith, is I probably haven't been as strong with one defined, voice about my faith with my girls, for example. But faith drives me, even today.
Hi. So I haven't read your book yet, admittedly. So I'm sorry if you touch on this
That's
in your
okay.
book.
That's why we're glad you're here.
I will find out. But I think you just touched on this when it comes to like faith-based organizations. I think some people are more, it's like more inherent for them to give back and to give to charity, whether that's because that's what their families do, or that's what their churches do, or they learn about injustices via their churches or whatnot. And I think what we're seeing now is a lot of people maybe they're not aware of the reality of like their own privilege or their opportunity and the way that they can give back. And my question to you is what do you think is the most effective way to get people who maybe haven't thought about this in their past to care? Is it like these people's true stories about the like horrors or injustices they've experienced and why, we're in a position to support them or to help them? Or I don't know. I feel like I grew up in an evangelical church, so we, heard these stories of like what Invisible Children was doing or whatnot, and I know a lot of people who didn't. And so my question is, how do we get them to kind of realize these things as not like far off stories, but as true things that they can see in like comparison to their own lives?
Yes. Well, it kicks in for people at different times, right? Your interest in working with others. I mean, as young professionals, you're just trying to make it in New York, get an apartment, have enough food to eat. But I think for me, I think that certainly storytelling and knowing that there's real progress, knowing that we've gone from 12 million to 5 million kids in a pretty short period of time, roughly 10 to 15 years, that's really powerful. Knowing that we're on the verge of eradicating extreme poverty. It's still going to be poverty, but there's a lot, that we have accomplished. Polio will be eradicated. I mean, there's just a lot that has happened in so many different issues, and we don't hear that all the time, right? But that's important to know that there is progress being made, because it can become very depressing, right? But I think rather than focusing on the stories or the work, or even, if others are doing it, because that is an important element as well, or if you're hearing about it at your church, I think what everybody's got to think about is their legacy. Do they want their legacy to include social impact? So when they think about their legacy, their family, and the world, do they think about the fact that we used to not think we could make a change. Now all of you, most of you are in this room, know you can make a change. You are connected to the world every day. You can connect to people all around the world, and you can make a change. And so the question for you is, just as it was for a generation before you who had to decide, we have to take ownership of our retirement. We have to take ownership of our own health, right? You have to, I think, decide that you're going to take ownership of your own social impact. And if that's part of your legacy, right? Now, if just making money, being successful is where you want to be, then this may not work. But if having an impact on society is part of what you want to have as your legacy, then you have to start being strategic, right? You don't just give because UNICEF sends you an email. Give to UNICEF because they are a strategic partner and they really care about millennials, and they have a council to bring those people together, and engage you, right? But think about maximizing your social impact. And I think if you do that because of your faith or your family or your work or your peers, the key is you've got an opportunity to change the world. That's what you don't want to give up.
Well, we have time for just one more question. It's yours. Yeah.
Hi. So, one of the kind of macro goals of the SDGs seems to be that equalizing opportunity across the global community, whether that's due to across race, across economic standing, across geographic location. And And I think an argument as to why certain subsets of communities or certain communities in general succeed as opposed to others is that their circumstances afford them the opportunity to excel. And I guess I'm wondering, because clearly your circumstances in your, in your life's history, in your story, in your journey, you came from a disenfranchised background. You came from a background that didn't have much opportunity given to you or handed to you. And so I'm wondering what your response to that is and how you leveraged your lack of opportunity to then excel and kind of make your own way and succeed.
Yeah. Well, I think for those who have, because I wanted my girls to have a great, beginning, I think that sometimes it's even harder to then think about what impact you want to have in the world. And it's probably even more important to think that through, if you've had a head start, right? And I feel good because my girls have done that, and you've done that. But I think that really the key is a couple of things. One of them is that we need to remember that these problems are not far away from us. So the United States has the largest income gap and gap between rich and poor that we've had probably since the Depression or earlier.
Inequality, which people forget, for which there is no metric. Inequality can be measured by the Gini coefficient, but wealth inequality has shot up even more, and not entirely because the wealthy have worked harder, because of quantitative easing. You've printed more money, so assets have increased in price. That is also a facet.
Absolutely.
I think both stock and flow both.
Absolutely. And so we have to be mindful of both of those factors. And they're happening, all around us, right? So, exactly. And so that's important, is that we're not very far away from those things. And I think the hurricanes, the earthquake in Mexico, make us realize that we all are vulnerable, right? But secondly is I think that it's just really important to say, I have been given these things, and what do I do with them? For me, it was two factors. It was education. So education was a great equalizer. So even if I was very poor and, I was the son of an interracial family, which meant nobody invited me to a party, let alone anything else, I could excel, right? I could excel in school. And secondly, it really was the love of other people all around me that helped me, again, get past the anger, which is what I hope you don't have to get past. For those of you that your journeys are very different and you didn't have those kind of circumstances, you'll have other circumstances, trust me, difficult in life. But if where you were born, or what family you were born into wasn't the difficult circumstance, it's a great head start, right? But you still have to be mindful that you have to make that choice every day of the positive.
Mr. Jackson, thank you for coming and thank you for speaking. Did you want to sign some books now?
Yes, and thank you, Strand
All right.
Books.